Today, I'm going to begin a discussion of The Place of Creation by Erich Neumann. And this book is part of a series of 3 books that contain essays by Erich Neumann. And I'll just give you a sense of what the 3 volumes are. The first volume is entitled Art and the Creative Unconscious. Good morning, Art. Nice to see you today. So the first volume is Art and the Creative Unconscious, and that is 4 essays on the psychological aspects of art. The study of Leonardo treats the work of art and the work itself not as ends in themselves, but rather as instruments of his inner situation. Art and Time and Creative Man and Transformation discuss the relation of art to its epoch, and specifically the relation of modern art to our own time. An essay on Chagall views this artist in the context of the problems explored in the other studies. And then the second volume is called Creative Man, 5 essays, and it's essays on the art of Franz Kafka, George Trakl, and Marc Chagall, with 2 brief papers on the creative in the work of Freud and Jung. The volume is prefaced by Gerhard Adler. And so those are the first 2 volumes, and then this is the 3rd volume, The Place of Creation, and how creation actually happens in human beings. And so I found the last essay in this group of essays to be quite powerful and relating to what has been happening to us with respect to our confluence. Good morning, Deanna. Nice to see you this morning. And so I wanted to talk about that and talk about how things happen. Now, in terms of archetype, before I get into the details of that, in terms of archetype, I just want to explain my understanding of the way archetypes work. Archetype, think of the archetype as kind of like a dry riverbed. And we all have these patterns in our lives, these dry riverbeds. And what happens is that the energy then comes in somehow. You see the person that you are attracted to, whether that be man or woman, and immediately some energy, some psychic energy is placed in that dry riverbed, and you are attracted to them. If it's a male-female partnership, it often is called love at first sight, and that can last through the honeymoon period. Everything's so exciting that you, in terms of getting ready for a marriage, and there's so many details to get ready, that you sort of aren't paying attention to any of the small stuff. You're just focusing on planning this event and this party. But they say that when the honeymoon is over, and the honeymoon is over when that projection that is coming out from your anima or your animus sort of shrivels up, and then you realize that you're actually there in the same room as your spouse, but they aren't necessarily the person that you thought they were when you were in this love at first sight honeymoon period. And then then comes the hard work of marriage, which is to work out how you're going to work together. But that's filling this dry riverbed of the archetype of marriage with the good stuff. That's who you are and what who you two people are as this couple. Now you're a couple. And Deanna likes that one. But and I wanted to give you all a link to our confluence for June because we do have still some space, but we're starting to get people's attention. So I just want to let you know how you can register your interest. And this is called the Creator's Art Confluence Art Psychology and Renewal. And so renewal is about putting energy back into your psyche. And we're going to show you how that's done. And it's how, among other things, that you can have renewal. And it's something that churches and religions have done for thousands of years because they open up, they put energy and material into these archetypal pathways, and they renew that every week. And what that does is it opens up a path to your unconscious, and at least for 1 hour a week, you can feel renewal, let's say. And because the unconscious is the healing power. So if you ever find yourself in trauma, you'll also find that the healing power is present and available if you only look inwardly, look to your unconscious for a solution. Now, I'm not selling any religion per se at all, but I'm simply saying that this is what religions do for you in a low-key way. Now, what we've understood is that there are ways to open up pathways to the unconscious so that you can feel this healing power. And, unfortunately, the rituals and so on of organized religion have lost their power in many ways. And so people have drifted away from organized religion. And so what we're going to show is a new way, a modern way to open up that pathway, because that's what we all need in order to heal ourselves and go on with our lives when something bad happens. Like, for example, if you wake up one fine day and realize that your spouse isn't the person that you wanted them to be, and it's not fixable, there's going to be a trauma when you break up, but then you have to open up the pathways to your unconscious to find a new way to live, to have happiness in your life again. And your unconscious is amazingly powerful at doing that. And so And one way is straight by psychology, by going to an analyst once a week for $150 a week or something like that. Or another way to do it is through the arts. And so during our confluence in Helena, Montana in June, we're going to be braiding together sort of power lines of energy and show you how it is done so that you can live a fuller life. And actually, there's nothing particularly new about this, except that it is a recognition that there's a method for doing it that's beyond the traditional religions. And so actually, Christ said this in John 10:10. He said that I'm not a thief in the night. I've come to give you fullness. I've come to give you life and in abundance, which means that what he meant was that he was going to guide people in the way of 2,000 years ago to have an opening to that unconscious healing power, and so that people could live in abundance. And so that's what even Jesus Christ was doing. But now, because a lot of people have drifted away from the traditional religions and they haven't understood it, and this includes theologians who haven't understood perhaps that they're talking about the psyche, the inner world, not the outer world. And so they've taught basically mythology, and because the scientific method came along and said, well, that's not true, and that's not true, and that's not true. And 500 years down the pipe from Galileo and Copernicus, we now see that the Christian myth per se isn't true in the physical world. It's not in the physical world. It's in the inner world, in the psychic world. And so Christ wasn't superhuman. He wasn't a better human than everybody else with a cape that could fly around in the sky. No, not at all. He was a genuine man who was showing the way to this inner world. And so he was supranatural. We can say he's supranatural, which means within, not supernatural. I'm going to put that on the chat. And so, we're still selling the idea of superheroes in our movie theaters today, obviously. And for example, with Spider-Man, who has the trauma of having a bad spider bite, and he has to go on, and he becomes supernatural. But in our actual lives, he has to become supranatural and understand the power of where he is now. And that would apply to all superheroes. They exist, but they exist in the deep unconscious. So what I wanted to do is read a passage here because it helped us to understand what it is we're trying to do in our confluence. And, I can't say that we understood it when I started to talk with Tim Holmes about it last May, but by the time we were together in Aptos, California in November, we really got it. We really grokked it because we felt it among ourselves. The six of us, all of whom are artists in some way, plus one is a psychiatrist and one is a psychologist. We understood that we were actually opening up this pathway, this conduit to the unconscious, and that it was hugely healing. And so the result of that was we came off of that weekend on an incredible high with one another, and so now we have grokked it, and that is a special gift. And so what I want to do is in the final essay of this book, the place of creation, I just want to read a short passage here and then talk about it and show how it applies here. Okay, so the human archetypes of mother and father, wise man and wise woman, etc., which are of such decisive importance for individual and cultural development, are dependent upon what I call personal evocation. This means that for the purpose of actualizing these archetypes, a fateful personal encounter, remember those words, a fateful personal encounter must take place with a human being in the outside world who is the bearer of the image which is archetypally appropriate for a given stage of development. It is true that there is a structural archetypal schema, for example, for the development of the ego and the conscious mind, and that there are archetypal phases which are inherent in the human psyche and which must be passed through in sequence. But for the individual development of the single human being, the general structural constitution is indissolubly connected with those persons in the human environment who evoke the archetypes concerned. And so the most obvious one is mother, obviously, and we experience her immediately and first. And so the mother archetype is like this dry riverbed that you come equipped with in your own psyche. And then the first thing that happens is you find out that you're in chaos because you have no idea what's going on. And here are my friends who are starting to try to use my website or my YouTube channel for improper purposes. So I'm eliminating them from the chat as we go. I apologize for that distraction. And so your mother starts to feed you, and that's the first thing that you need, and it's pleasant as opposed to the chaos that's happening around you in the room as you're born. And so the energy goes to her. And right then, the very first act of a child is to start putting energy through that archetype of the mother. And so that's what happens. And so it is a fateful personal encounter because your fate and your destiny is coming from that specific person. And so it includes, where in the world you're born, what the education level is of your parents, all those things. but uh, the, but they already go in a pre-existing riverbed, if you think of it that way. So that later comes into relationships with other individuals and with other archetypes. And so, but in any case, each of the archetypes, you have to pass through it in sequence, and it develops stronger and stronger. And as any mother knows, once you're a mother for life. You're putting energy into that riverbed, and you as an individual, as the mother, have energy in that, and that energy gets then projected out to your children, and that will never change in your lifetime, no matter what happens. And so that's the way we live. That's the way human beings live. Okay, so reading on here, the fact that the human archetypes are dependent on a personal evocation implies as well that destiny, in the form of the personal individual dimension, already is in place in the constitution of human nature. So in other words, we all have a destiny, and that destiny is, develops out as we develop as individuals. This individual quality towards which the human element in the psyche is oriented is not simply based on the uniquely predetermined constitution of the single human being, his heredity, in fact, which is bound to realize itself in terms of a specific society, environment, and period, but is dependent in its very nature on fateful encounters in the form of relationships which are, as it were, prepared for him with other individuals who are fulfilling and suffering their own destiny. So I immediately started to put this together with a couple of the people that are organizing the confluence with me. And so anyway, reading on, society as the group, environment as the homeland, society as the group, environment as the homeland, and period as the historical location make up what we may call the external coordinates of individuality. Personal destiny, on the other hand, a good or a bad mother, a strong or a weak father, who activate the archetypal structures which determine the development of the boy or girl. All this is part of the unique constellation of destiny, which influences the individual apart from and beyond his species and the social group. Conformity with the species does not mean simply preformed form, i.e., the reverse of freedom, but also collective direction, i.e., totally uniform conditioned behavior. In the case of man, the prepared and a priori given collective constitution of the psyche has to be evoked by unique and non-repeatable personal encounters. The result is that beyond the collective variance in the socio-psychic group dimensions, a unique modification of the basic structure of humanity is activated on as occasion arises. Now, this is Erich Neumann writing about this 60 years ago, and basically, from my point of view, and I think the point of view of our organizers, that happened to us. In other words, we had this a unique and non-repeatable personal encounter with one another. That was what happened to us in November And the result is that beyond collective variance in the socio-psychic group dimension, a unique modification of the basic structure of humanity is activated as occasion arises. So what this means is that because of this personal encounter, which we hadn't really been expecting, what we were thinking of. Deanna, thank you so much for your super chat. I appreciate that very much. When Tim and I were first thinking of this and bringing it together, at first we were thinking of putting together a conference, I think, something like that, where we bring in subject matter experts and they have their discrete silo, and you can go from classroom to classroom and understand what their topic is, but it doesn't pull it together for you. And what we discovered by this sort of random opportunity together is that there's something archetypal going on, and that we're all bringing the energy into it. So that's why we're calling it a confluence rather than a conference, because a conference would be like all the conferences you've ever been to of whatever type. But this confluence is braiding together psychic energy, which is creating something new and very strong. Now, one of the things that Jung has always been accused of is that he was aiming to create a new religion. And because of the parallels that I discussed earlier of how religion activates the healing power in the psyche, that's what it does. So when you go to church and you go through these traditional rituals or whatever, or you see certain images, they are activating a pathway from your ego mind to your self, to your God image. And so they naturally, because you're doing that and you're taking yourself out of your day-to-day struggle for that 1 hour, let's say a week, it's a naturally healing process. So if you do it, whether or not you quote unquote believe in God, it's not a question of that, because if you do this and understand what it is doing for you, you will know. It's not a question. It's by experience. It's not by anybody convincing you. Okay, so in other words, you don't have to believe anything that your church actually teaches. I mean, you can say, oh, that's magic hocus pocus if you want. But the reality in depth psychology is about experience. It's not about being convinced by somebody yelling at you and convincing you that you have to do it my way or the highway. It's not about that at all. It's about, so it's not about believing in God. It's about knowing God. And what is God? God is an image in the unconscious. It is the unconscious, in fact. And simply by going through these rituals, whether you believe it or not, you are causing yourself to reflect and therefore experience what these rituals are meant to do, which was to connect you up with the unconscious. Well, that worked very well for 2,000 years and pretty well for the last 500. But it became more and more attenuated because of the scientific method, which said that, wow, these stories aren't true. Well, it doesn't matter if they're true, as a matter of fact, because they are true in your psyche. But it doesn't matter that they're not true in the physical world. And that's what we have missed. That's what the scientific method is missed. That's what the rationalists who want to insist on having something, something physical that they can refer to. Our confluences in Helena, Montana, and that Helena is named after Saint Helena, who found the literal physical cross of Jesus Christ, or at least so the story goes. And as my mother used to say, well, if it's not true, it ought to be. and her point was that stories are true. And when the church says they're true enough for you to be a saint, lots of people believed that for hundreds of years and accepted that. Because, wow, we spent 100 years building this cathedral, and the Vatican took like 1,500 years to get to what it is now. So it should be must be true if people put that much time into it. And as I see these Russian bots, I'm knocking them out as fast as I can. And so anyway, the point is that what we've finally rocked ourselves, and what Jung was always talking about, is that depth psychology and psychology in general is all about experience. It's not about something in the physical world. But nonetheless, it is a science, and we know how it works, and we know how psychotherapy can heal you because it's causing you to connect with your unconscious, which is the healing power. And it's all powerful. In fact, it's really powerful, and it can cause you to have, a life, and it causes you to have a life in abundance. And you don't always get what you want, you get something else, but your unconscious will tell you what is the next thing to do. And that's God for all intents and purposes. And so anyway, reading on here, the development of each single human being is in fact an interchangeable combination. I'm sorry. The development of each single human being is in fact an uninterchangeable combination of given archetypal, biopsychic, and sociopsychic factors with unique individual experiences. Hence, the life of every man, whether he is aware of it or not, represents a synthesis between the person and the myth. In every case, the archetypal stages of the development of the ego and the conscious mind correspond with mythical phases, which can be characterized by the modification of archetypal figures and constellations from the psychic background. Okay, so these archetypes exist in the psychic background, such as the Great Mother, the Divine Child, the Young Hero, the Great Father, the Fight with the Dragon, the Marriage of Death, etc. And yet, indissolubly linked as it is with these figures, the development of the person as an individual continues to run its course in its uniqueness, its earthly determinateness, and at the same time, its freedom. And so you can pay attention to what I'm saying about it or not. You're entirely free to do that. And Deanna says, keeping it as positive as I can. And all of us, need to accentuate the positive and eliminate the negative in our lives. That's the essence of what God tells us in myriad ways. I mean, if you don't follow the guidance of the unconscious, you will be miserable. That's how depression takes place, at least in my opinion. And I'm not a licensed psychotherapist nor a psychiatrist, but now I'm starting to get it. In this connection, it is perhaps necessary to make the point that the thrust forward to a new phase of development never abrogates the validity of its predecessor. You can't get out of life alive. Whatever you've lived, you've lived. That's your history. The tradition-bound psyche of the group must always maintain its relationship with the biopsyche of the species, since otherwise the group itself will come to grief. And similarly, the individual psyche of each person must not lose contact with the group if it is to avoid incurring the gravest danger. And so what we see in the individual is that, things can come up in an individual life that cause you to do something, like the January 6th attack on our Capitol, but those people actually lost contact with the group, which is the United States of America. And the problem that we have been having in our country is that both sides are pulling as hard as they can in divisiveness to pull apart. And yet the solution to the problem is not to continue to pull apart, because then we have a national neurosis, but rather to find ways that we have common ground. And so that's the whole point of staying in contact with the group. If we can't wear purple shirts instead of blue and red shirts, then we've got a national neurosis that needs some resolution. And so I'm going to read that last sentence again, because it applies directly to us in the United States and to many other places in the world. The tradition-bound socio-psyche of the group must always maintain its relationship with the biopsyche of the species. So it must be related to us physically, since otherwise the group itself will come to grief. If our society doesn't support us, we'll come to grief, because it'll be every man and woman for themselves, and that won't work very well. Since otherwise the group itself comes to grief, and similarly, the individual psyche of each person must not lose contact with the group if it is to avoid incurring the gravest danger. And of course, we're seeing a close and personal demonstration of that, because the people that did lose contact with the United States of America and decided to try to destroy a part of it murderously, they're going to face the consequences of that activity. And the group can't accept it, cannot, because if we accept it, then we destroy our society, and that can't happen. So but here's the point. Yet in every case, connectedness also involves conflict. Okay, so here's Erich Neumann predicting 60 years ago that we would have conflict. Just as no group can develop its own essential quality in any other way than by emphasizing certain archetypal constellations of the collective human psyche, while at the same time neglecting others. So too, the creative individual is also involved in a relationship of necessity and inescapable tension with the highest values and traditions of the group. And so we see this in all great artists who, they are no longer part of the mass. They have pulled away from the group in important ways, sometimes to shine a light on what it is we're doing. And so there's a tension that gets expressed through the art. So anyway, which he in part affirms, in part denies. So if we look at the work of Tim Holmes, he in part affirms the Christian message, and that's partially because his family business was Methodist ministers going back 6 generations. But it partly denies it too, because it says, it's something else than the way it's been described in sort of magical terms. But destiny means not only that the life of the single human person, embodying as it does the ego self structure, leads to the individual becoming an ego and developing a conscious mind, but also that this life, in its totality as the self, presses onward to the fulfillment of the uniqueness of the individual in his condition limitation and in his freedom. And so we see that certainly in my life, as things have changed over time. I always press forward and make myself more and more unique. That doesn't mean I'm in any way better, but I recognize my limitation and I find another solution. So, I loved going to law school. I detested practicing law. And so when I finally acknowledged that after 5 years of practicing law, then I moved on and found another way to express myself, which was to go into business. And that did provide me with enough freedom so that I could fully express my creativity, which was to create businesses. Okay, so the unity of person and destiny, like the unity of individuality and life, can best be demonstrated if we take as our example creative man in his capacity as, and here he says, the great individual. I make no such claim, but we become a unique, individuated person, and that makes all the difference. And as Robert Frost said, two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and said I could not follow both. I stood as long as I could, since both seemed a good way to go. But then I took the road less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. And that is what we must do if we're going to have an individuated life, if we're going to live our life instead of somebody else's life. And so if you're working for a company, you probably have to do that to make a living and raise your family, and that's part of your individuation. But that's a limitation. It means that you don't have the freedom to do other things, and this is why understanding the creative side is so important, so that you can find a way to have freedom to create. Okay, so the unity of person and destiny, like the unity of individuality and life, can best be demonstrated if we take as our example creative man in his capacity as the great individual. However, creative man and sick man are both elucidations of man as such, only because in both of these cases, the onward thrust of the ego towards the self and the fulfillment of individuality as a unity of ego and self is inescapable. The former must achieve unity because his ego existence is over and over being directed in the creative process by his existence as the self, and must recognize and come to terms with this fact. The sick man because of his sick ego life, can only be restored to health if it recovers its connection with the compensatory healing and whole-making reality of the self. And what now we're recognizing that Jungian analysts have always been saying is that the essence of Jungian psychology is to put you back in contact with your inner world. And there is where the healing power is found. And so this is the energy that we're going to bring to our confluence in June, which is to show you not that there's one specific answer, but you will feel the energies and they will be numinous. And you will, as you come away from the confluence, you will in no way can you miss feeling renewed. You will feel renewed, even if you think that every word we say at the confluence is baloney, because if you do that, if you were to come to the confluence and take the contrary side to everything we say, you would still, in order to come to that conclusion, you would have had to make contact with your unconscious, and that will start to direct your life and your destiny in certain ways, and so you won't be able to escape that fact, and so it sort of achieves our purpose in a backhanded way, even if you are contrary to everything we say. And so, literally that's what happens in these Sunday morning sessions, where you are listening to me and, you're weighing every word that I say, whether it resonates with you or not. And in that process, you're measuring it about what against what your unconscious says. So that that reflection about whether what I say is true or not, that reflection is causing this opening of this channel between your ego mind and your unconscious. And that's why we have a number of regulars here who come every week. They come because maybe they don't know why it is that they like what is being said, but they know they like it. And so, as a result of that, we get many people connecting over the week. Maybe not all get up in time to watch a 9 a.m. Eastern time session. And actually, I don't do these sessions aimed at the United States because I know my fellow Americans would rather sleep in on Sunday morning, but I'm trying to express some of these messages to other parts of the world, and so that's why I do it at this time. So one of the essential prerequisites of the possibility of experiencing the ego self nature in man is what depth psychology calls introversion, which means becoming aware not only of the inwardness, but of the inner being of man. And so what this is saying is that you may be the most extroverted person on earth and think that, everything has to be physically present in order to have any meaning for your life. But by listening to what I say or listening to what a pastor says in their sermon every week, you are making a connection. You're looking inwardly in terms of whether you agree or not. And it really doesn't matter whether you agree or not, because your unconscious is going to tell you what is right and what is wrong. It isn't me that's going to tell you. I'm only giving you a way to do it. And so I'll read a little bit more here. Okay, so among living creatures other than man, life takes one single direction, which is turned outwards toward the world, and which we might describe broadly as extroversion. So in other words, if you're a gazelle on the African plain, your psyche is turned outward all the time, because you won't survive if you don't keep evaluating who's in your vicinity, friend or foe. You have to identify friend or foe, and if it's foe, you have to run away. And what you have, as a gazelle, what you have been endowed with through evolution is speed. And so if a predator is there, you can recognize it and run away, and so it is with all of us. We have to identify friend or foe, and if somebody is bad for our life or something is bad for our life, we need to cut that away from our life. We need to get away from it, and so. So going on, it is true that the living creatures possess something inner that acts as a biopsychic determinant of their behavior. This, however, directs their relationship with the world without being mirrored, i.e., reflected as such, since no ego consciousness exists at this stage. The same preponderance of extroversion has a similar effect in the primitive phase of the evolution of man. In fact, it still penetrates and profoundly influences the behavior of modern man. This means that even where something inner is at work, it appears in the form of something outer. We have only to think of the indestructible self-evidence of our sensory apparatus, which has the effect of an entity within us that pictures and therefore structures the outer world in a way fixed by law and characteristic of man. An entity, moreover, which for purposes of our direct experience is indispensable and can never be eliminated. What depth psychology describes as projection is only the continuation of this primary extroversion of the biopsychic life processes. And so, falling in love at first sight, for example, is because you have projected on the other person, what your unconscious tells you is a perfect person for you, a perfect life mate. And so that's a primary extroversion, but it is a primary extroversion for the purpose of reproduction. And so we can say that in every case, our ancestors, going back to single-celled organisms, have done two things successfully. They have survived until they reproduced. And so this falling in love at first sight is a evolutionary archetype which causes us to want to reproduce. And that is what continues on our species and all other species. And so one of the interesting things that Dr. Neumann was talking about early in this essay, and I'm talking about this book, The Place of Creation, is that this does go back to single-celled organisms. And so the single-celled organism has a membrane that forms it. Okay, in other words, the living contents of the cell is within a boundary, and what's within the boundary is introversion, and what is outside the boundary, and so what's within the boundary is also a limitation, and the freedom of the cell is only to identify a center around which it wants to congregate, because it's the same kind of cell. And so when the human being forms in the womb, liver cells, something archetypal, something in the DNA, tells us that at this particular stage in our development, we need to create a liver. And so that process is continuing, and it goes on through the whole 9 months of gestation, and it goes on with respect to every unique part of our bodies, including our lungs and our kidneys and our sense organs, our head and everything about our body. But the energies go through these archetypal phases, and they have to go through in a certain order. And what happens is, as cells develop, they tend to congregate to the organ that they're going to be, whether they like it or not. And so that's true all the way down to single-celled organisms. And it might explain, among other things, why people tend to be attracted to cities, and cities tend to get bigger and bigger because it's a congregate, it's a congregation of other human beings. So it brings us close to our species, to more members of our species. And so the formation of a city might be analogous to the formation of your kidneys, something like that. And, that's a pretty profound thought, but nonetheless, I think it's right. Let's see here. Okay, I'll read a little bit more here. Let me just check one thing. See if I have a message. So I will come back to you. And so it is not until something which we can already call inwardness is evolved in the higher animals that the possibility begins to emerge that this inwardness could be not only used but actually perceived by living creatures, though its function is always to tone or dispose them toward extroversion for purposes of courting, competing with rivals, breeding, etc. Phenomena which we should at first sight be glad to describe as simply expressive of inwardness. For example, birdsong are in fact meaningful forms of extroversion, which aim at special effects and serve the purpose of the preservation of life and of the species, even if these phenomena contain an element of creatively superabundant vitality, which transcends the category of biological experience. They are not an expression of the individual inwardness that is to be found, for example, in the most primitive love song. Even in a love song, the part played by the kind of courting that preserves the species must not be overlooked. Yet this is now enclosed in a unique and reflective inwardness that expresses itself individually in a specific language and in a form that is already in part determined socio-psychically, i.e. through the medium of tradition and period in the context of a specific social group. So, there are some things that are naturally filling in these archetypes as we develop during the period of gestation and during the period of growing up. But they aren't individual. And so when we spend all of our evenings staring at a television set, what we're doing is we're making ourselves just another cog in the wheel, let's say. Or if we're going down the road staring at our cell phones, it means we're trying to find affinity for things that are happening someplace else. We're not there, but we can see it through our cell phones. And so we are attracted to that. But in order to become an individual and to individuate, you actually have to turn the television off. And you actually have to put your cell phone down and reflect yourself on what you feel. And that requires maturity. I mean, in the first 21 years of life before you're an adult, obviously, your job is to grow up and to become an adult, to become a mature adult. And so you're looking for all those affinities. But once you reach that point, then you have to find what your differences are. And that's what artists do. That's what artists do. They express their differences. The primary extroversion of living creatures, which is still to be found residually among ourselves, begins to be succeeded by something new at the point where the specifically human development of the psyche becomes manifest. With the emergence of the tension between ego consciousness and the unconscious, which is the basis of the new creative and formative phase of the human psyche, the polarization of the world into an outer and inner, a physical and a spiritual psychic world, now begins to take visible form. So we see that where we see typically men, working out at the gym, while typically women are found in yoga groups. And so women tend to be more reflective of the inner world, men of the outer world. And so let's see. So reading on, a process is now initiated in which the ego becomes Janus-faced, i.e., achieves a line of vision, which is no longer unipolar or exclusively turned toward the environment in the sense of the outside world. So long as this Janus-facedness, which, though active and effective, remains unconscious, the so-called inner side will also appear as an outside. One essential consideration, which helps to explain why man finds it so difficult to overcome the tendency in the vital process towards extroversion, is to be found in the fact that one of the most fundamental qualities of the psyche is its capacity to form images, or in other words, to transform dynamic force that is essentially non-pictorial into terms of appearance, i.e., something ostensibly perceptible in the outside world. And so this is what artists are doing. They're feeling, they're experiencing something that's pushing them out to express something that's in their world into a place where it can be recognized and understood. Let's see, I have a friend from Vancouver who is joining us, Idris.
Good morning, sir.
Hi, how are you?
I am well, thank you. How are you?
Quite well. And it's nice to have a counterpart for discussion here. It's quite early for you.
I'll be getting ready in one moment. Thank you for letting me in.
Okay. Okay. And so, I don't mean to say that a man in the gym isn't also being reflective, because obviously if you're lifting weights, or even if you're jogging or something like that, you tend to also be aware of an inner feeling that's going on. But the lifting of weights per se is to present something in the outer world, maybe to be more attractive to women, or it may be to be able to fight an adversary. And you may have that purpose. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like you to meet Idris, my friend of a couple of years, who is a very spiritual person, and knows a lot about these things. And so I'm sure our discussion will be enhanced by his presence here today. So Idris, have you been following what the discussion has been so far, since it's been a soliloquy from Skip?
Good morning and good afternoon, good evening, everyone, wherever you are. I have attended the previous sessions where you were speaking with Jordan and you were discussing about art.
Yes.
About today's session, I just joined this moment. So I'll actually travel with you from this moment onwards.
Okay. All right. Well, that may be a little difficult, but anyway, I'm going to read down the rest of this page. All right. So the so-called inner dimension, in fact, appears to pre-modern man as an outer dimension. However, it is nevertheless generally removed into a special separate world, which is in direct contrast to external reality. To this world belongs the spiritual psychic world of supernatural powers, the demons, spirits, and gods, who are in themselves essentially invisible, but who appear in the world and have the capacity to incorporate themselves in parts of the world, and yet in their essential nature are not of this world. So I can say that when I slept for the first time in Tim Holmes' studio, which is filled with Tim's spirit from 4 decades of artistic work, there were many ghosts that were presented, because when you go to sleep, you tend to leave aside your conscious mind, and something unconscious can take place. And so what was happening to me was this more primitive aspect of this separate world, where ghosts and goblins and things can appear. And oh my heavens, what, when that happens to you, you definitely feel that they're real, and they surely are real. But it's because your psyche is back at a more primitive level, where your conscious mind isn't changing the isn't blotting out what's going on in the psyche. And let me just say about dreams, and Idris, you can address this, I think. We are actually receiving messages from our unconscious 7 by 24 by 365 all the time. And it's simply a question of paying attention to them. And so, sometimes, in primitive people, sometimes they break through in the conscious mind, and they become visions, okay, like many of the early religious people had visions and dreams. Of course, the Bible is entirely based on them, pretty much. And so, when your psyche really wants you to know something, it will give you a vision. It will force it through so that you pay attention. And in terms of, for me, it comes through as a radar detector on the highway, where I don't need to have any physical radar detector on my dashboard, because every time that there's police activity in my area, I get this one vision. My psyche says police, or it says predator or something like that. I mean, at a more primitive level, it's saying
Perhaps
predator.
you can hear their car or their siren, but not to the conscious level. So auditory, probably you can hear the type of the vehicle they're driving or their siren already from a distance, but not on conscious level. Like your body is receiving those vibrations, and then
which I agree with. So if you're driving along the highway, for example, and there's a very slight change in the closure between your car and the oncoming cars, so that the speed difference has changed very slightly, imperceptibly in terms of the conscious mind. Your psyche is taking that in, and it's saying, you're not going, this period of closure is different from all the other times. So why is it different? Well, it might be different because these oncoming cars have already seen a speed trap. And
same is true if you're walking on a street and somebody is just hiding on a corner and looking at you. Somewhere you just want to turn around and see if really somebody is watching from a distance, and you actually see there is somebody standing in an unnatural spot, like an unusual spot for whatever their own purpose. But they are actually looking at you at that point. And it's unusual because our vision is 270 degrees, not 360. But still somewhere in our psyche, we catch that.
Right.
I also want to discuss this briefly, that in India, they say that human beings go through 3 states of consciousness: deep sleep, dreaming, and waking. But if you actually pay close attention, they say that inside waking, the waking qualities of 3 kinds. One resembles deep sleep, but within the category of waking world. One resembles dreaming, but within the category of waking world. And one is pure awake, that is within. And then the other 2 are also divided into these 3. So, and connected to this, I also want to say that the physical world around us hypnotizes very, very strongly. And
it does what very, very strongly?
Hypnotizes very strongly, the physical world around us.
Hypnotizes.
And yes. And second is that we only observe things that we're expecting. So those become hooks. In psychology, they call it anchoring. So when we enter a mall, we only observe things that we expect them to be, whether certain stores or certain workers or certain bins at certain locations or water fountains. Now, because that's our ego consciousness. We only expect things that we have a certain framework in our mind. But in dreams and in visions, this breaks through. Because there we are not filtering. We are actually drinking 100% of the information coming in. And our psyche is translating it into primitive images. That you could call it ghost, goblin, but they all have a meaning. And whatever meaning it stands for you, your psyche will translate into that specific meaning.
Precisely.
Recently, I read that Dr. Jung said it doesn't matter which dream interpretation system you believe in, each one will work, because next time you fall asleep, if you have made an error in interpretation, according to the system of dream interpretation that you believe, you will get that kind of dream that will correct your previous interpretation of the previous dream.
Right. So it doesn't matter whether you believe Dr. Jung or not, you're going to get fed the correct answer when you're asleep.
So it's exactly the same. If you are seeing visions and it means certain things to you, then that environment, that place, that time is giving you enough information.
Right. And so when I spent 2 nights in Tim's studio, oh my gosh, I knew that the studio is haunted, right? And my psyche was accepting that. And so when I took away my ego mind and went to sleep, of course, I'm going to have dreams and visions that are that, and I remember them very clearly. And there's so much spirit. I mean, Tim has spread around in his studio perhaps 5,000 drawings. I don't know, quite a few drawings in different ways. I mean, they're in drawers and various things, but he's put his spirit into those works of art and the sculptures as well. And so,
and has given those forms a permanent or semi-permanent form, because
right,
each of the sculptures he has made, and he's made like 40 of each and 30 of each, those will stay for next 1,000 years or 2,000 years if nothing's actually done.
Yeah, he says 5,000 years because
5,000
they're bronze, and so when they're bronze does not deteriorate for 5,000 years.
And even paper, 200 years in regular room conditions.
Yeah, sure.
100 to 200 years, yeah.
Right. And so anyway, so let me reread that paragraph again in the context of what we've been saying. The so-called inner dimension, in fact, appears to pre-modern man as an outer dimension. However, it is nevertheless generally removed into a special, separate world, which is in direct contrast to the external reality. To this world belongs the spiritual psychic world of supernatural powers and demons, spirits and gods, who are in themselves essentially invisible, but who appear in the world and have the capacity to incorporate themselves in parts of the world, and yet in their essential nature are not of this world. And so, example of incorporating in parts of the world, an example would be cathedrals. So, someone last week, I think, sent me a video that showed how many cathedrals there are in the world, and there many of them are in very unexpected places. For example, in Cambodia, there's a couple of cathedrals, and in certain parts of China there are cathedrals, and I have personal experience with the Cathedral of Yokohama when I was in high school, and from Texas says the inner world doesn't have the same limitations as the world we inhabit. Yes, that's correct. But if you look at cathedrals around the world, they're essentially all built on the same plan. It's very interesting. I mean, with some very rare exceptions, but they can be very rudimentary or they can be very ornate, like the Gaudi Cathedral in Barcelona. What is it? The sun. It's the Sacred Family, anyway, and in Spanish, the Cathedral of the Sacred Family in Spanish. And that's a very ornate cathedral that's been under construction for 140 years. Okay, but nobody's doubted what the basic form of that cathedral should be since the beginning. It has some artistic uniqueness, but it's very much in the human psyche because of the idea of the cathedral has been spread around the world for at least 1,000 years. I mean, I think Chartres was built in 1260 or something like that, and so people all over the world are aware of that now and have had drawings of it or descriptions of it. And so
And it comes in dreams, and some people implement it. I know about this person who told me that he was traveling for a healing purpose, like a medical appointment.
Yeah.
And on the way, he found a piece of Starbucks cup that was almost cut around this female figure. And he felt like that looks like Mother Mary. Now, here is where I'm actually discussing how psyche is important. Now, he said he has to honor this feeling and thought that he has come across this piece of paper, and he sees Mother Mary in that. If anyone is familiar with the logo of Starbucks symbol, and
Sure.
we're not advertising, we don't have any stocks with Starbucks, but it is a female, and it's solemnly looking, very simple, like very few lines have made that logo.
Right.
So he said that there was a plain ground, there are a few trees in it, and it was not used. And far away from it was a parking lot. So what he did is he took that piece of paper and put some stones around it under a tree. So he just created a shrine. But lo and behold, next week when he came to this same place for appointment, a fence, a rented fence of metals was placed in the whole area, vicinity around the tree. This land for years and years, nobody was claiming and nobody was putting a fence or building on this land. Now the whole place, actually from a distance, if somebody knows the story and walks, in the center there is the tree, there are some stones on the ground. You cannot see Mother Mary's photo, but the whole thing has become like a space which is fenced around. Space. And yes, a sacred space is created from profane space. And if someone has studied Marcia Iliad's book, they will understand what I'm speaking. But the psyche just worked there. Whoever is the owner of the land or the new owner, without even knowing, put the fence in such a way that's exactly that tree is the center and the fences around it. And there is a shrine there for whoever knows. Now, you guys know, you don't know the location, but you know the story.
Yeah, we know the story. And so we know that we can envision the Virgin Mary, let's say, and we could create a circle of stones envisioning the Virgin Mary in that location, and other people would come along and see the circle of stones but not see the Virgin Mary, but still think that that's a sacred space. Now, so from Texas says cathedrals create a sacred place, and Justin corrects my Spanish. He says La Sagrada Familia, the sacred family, which is the name of the Gaudi. They call it the Gaudi Cathedral because a man named Gaudi designed it, and some people love it and some people hate it. Some people call it Gaudi's candlesticks or something.
Excuse me, in which city is this?
It's in Barcelona, Spain, and it's supposed to be finished in 2026. That's supposed to be the finishing date of it. So it's quite built up now and ready to go. I think they've been having services in it for quite a long time, as a matter of fact. But I visited it in early 1980s, so 42 years ago. And it was a place that our hosts had to take you to, but it got late. And so they took us in a bus, and it was late at night. And all we could see was the wooden barriers around it, the construction barriers around it. That's all we saw. But I can say that I've been to the Gaudi Cathedral, but when I went there, I didn't see it. All I saw was, wooden fences all around it. But I'd like to go back now sometime and see it in its form.
For some of the people who are really practical minded, or they want to see the use of this pragmatically, what I want to say is that if you have any artistic endeavor and you put your vision into a practice, you create an art, this will give you enough confidence or experience that you can actually hold a vision together about a certain future that you want for yourself or your loved ones, and
Yeah.
then walk towards it. And your previous implementation of that artwork or the dream that you represented in a drawing or sculpture, that would be the evidence for you that you can do this one too. Whatever
Yeah.
we possess is the gift of our attention.
Yeah.
As long as we
And-
keep attention, we will have our material possession, friends, and health, and all good things.
Yeah.
Attention keeps all our possessions within our possessiveness.
Right.
So,
And so they often would talk about, visioning your future as a way to move forward. And, I remember that I was visioning on about, I'd say 4 or 5 different planes. So one of the things that I was envisioning was to build a arts community at the farm that my family had. And my unconscious, at my father's death, my unconscious told me to give my share of this farm to my daughters to protect it. But what they did was they sold it. So therefore that avenue was cut off for me. And now if I had focused on the farm and tried to actually physically do it, yes, I would have gotten that. Then another one was I was envisioning myself to be a general officer in the Marine Corps, a general. And when I was a lieutenant colonel, we had weather like we have outside now, which is extremely slippery weather. We have ice and snow on the ground, but then it starts to melt a little bit. And that's very treacherous. And I've had 3 falls because of that kind of weather. And the first one was on January the 4th, 1990. This is how I started off the decade of the 90s. I broke my leg. And that was literally Edinger would say that accident was literally my unconscious telling me it didn't want me doing that, right?
you're not the sole master in your house.
Right. And so that's what Edinger would say, so that, if you have an accident, it can be because your unconscious doesn't like the way you're moving. And so that vision got cut off, right? But various other things did emerge. I got into business, and I manifested several companies, including one that became public. And that was a process that I was quite familiar with and worked for me for many years. But then in 2008, boom, that was gone because of the destruction of the economy and my loss of my life savings. So I wasn't going to do that in that same way. Now it happens that I've been keeping my powder dry for all these years, and now I may be at the cusp of doing it again with another public company, but it's still years away, and it's something that I envision with several people overseas.
Your story gives me a vision that you're following the vein of gold that's running through the mountain. But
Right.
then you're predicting that vein will have a certain shape, but it actually has a different shape.
Right.
But kudos to you that you don't actually stop following the highest value that you envision, and you follow that. But then you don't know how the vein will look, that vein of gold. Somewhere it's thinner, somewhere it's fatter, and it will be in a slightly different spot at a slight different angle. But you're following that thread of gold, and that's alchemical work.
Right. And there's actually 2 there's actually two veins. One vein is a rational vein, which is this business vein, which nobody really here knows anything about. And then the other vein is a vein that tells me that there's something about Jung's work that's important. I don't know what exactly. And I've kept, because it's been interesting enough to me and has gradually built out other parts of my psyche, it now has emerged as this confluence that we're going to do in the end of June or the middle of June. I hope you'll be there, Andres.
I hope so too.
You will make definitely make a contribution to it. You need to register with Tim though, if you're going to do it. Okay, so you have to go to the website and put in what you think this confluence is about. But I'll tell you what it's about. It's about bringing together strands of energy into one place at one time. And it will be like nuclear fission. In other words, it will be numinous and everybody will feel renewed by it. And the way we know that is because we actually did it with the organizers in November, and that's what happened to us. And so now we're simply bringing it to other people, and we recognize it because we're all interested in Jung at one level or another, and so we know it. We know what we see. So Justin says, I visited Gaudi's cathedral many times over the years and seen the progress they've made building it. Barcelona has many other buildings conceived by Gaudi and also a park. Interesting. I'd like to go back to Barcelona in the daylight. One of the things that I found very distasteful about international work, which I had not anticipated, is that when you're in a meeting room having a business discussion, you could be anywhere in the world. Okay, they're all the same. And if you're staying at the Marriott Hotel or the Hilton Hotel or what have you, they're pretty much all the same. And so, I used to stay at the Marriott Hotel in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, and you would expect something that's very different from the American way of life in that hotel, but not really. They're pretty much all the same. We've been in one ballroom, you've been in all of them, and if you've been in one conference room, you've been in all of them. And so that what I expected to be an interesting part of my international travels didn't actually pan out. And I almost never, only by insisting upon it, did I ever get any of my colleagues to take me touring so that I could actually see the so-called sites of any of the cities I would visit. So even in India, where I have probably spent 2 years of my life at this point in 2 to 4 week segments, but quite a lot of my time over years has been in India. It's only by insisting that I ever got out to see anything. And I, to this day, even though I've been there 44 times, believe it or not, I've been to India 44 times, but I have never gone to the Taj Mahal. And the reason for that is, and that has been quite intentional, and the reason is that my wife was also traveling to India quite a lot, but we committed to one another that we would only see the Taj Mahal, which is dedicated to love, together. we would only go to the Taj Mahal together. So, someday I would love to get there with my wife, but I won't go without that.
Sometimes I quip that tourists see a place far better than the residents. Same would be about employees who are traveling there for a meeting. I live in Vancouver, but tourists would actually see more of spots and will experience a very much better month when it's July or August than a July and August that I'm working and I'm busy with my house responsibilities and everything. So
so that that's the same for me. I've been to Vancouver, but in July and August. I've been there to go on a cruise to Alaska, and I probably know Vancouver better than, or not. I don't know the city better than you who live there, but I certainly got to see the highlights.
Yeah, the beautiful spots, the places that gives you lots of joy. Yes.
Right. And so, anyway, you have to insist. Otherwise, in international business, we do this business the same way everywhere in the world. I mean, when I was in high school, the international language of business was French. And so the justification for studying French was that, there's so many places in the world that speak French that, it would be the most useful thing. And it's one of the diplomatic languages. But actually, that's been overwhelmed. And even though I have studied Chinese and Japanese and Arabic and Spanish, I never use them because the world got taken over by English. And so the international language is no longer French, it's English. And if you don't speak
it's very easy. It's a very easy language. Whoever has learned English and they also know some other foreign language, they say English is easier. So it's a very easy language for an outsider, yes.
Right. And Chinese is easy in that way because Chinese has almost exact grammatical equivalence to English. And so if you learn the vocabulary in Chinese, you can speak Chinese if you're an American, but if you have Japanese, that's a completely different story because a Chinese sentence will be put together exactly how an English sentence is put together, but in Japanese, you have to wait for the verb until the end of the sentence. And
your knowledge of psyche will also help because if you know people and their emotions and intentions and how they will have expectation of a certain setup, then you will understand them with far fewer words than someone who doesn't know anything about psyche and they're trying to just communicate with a linguistic language. Yeah. So here is again the importance of the psyche in the material you're presenting.
Yeah. So I want to read one more paragraph, and then I want to show you a painting, so that you see what this paragraph is talking about. Primarily, the emergence of images in the psyche possessed a purely directive significance. This was true irrespective of whether the image was an outer image of reality or what we should describe as an inner image. For example, whether early man was warned as he entered a forest by the outer image of a beast of prey or by the inner image of a spirit, the intention and effect of the image in every case was that the man was altered and put on his guard. And so you can just, it's like my traveling on highways where if the speed changes, it's the spirit of the fact of traveling down the highway and the
air pressure.
The closure speed changes or somebody flashes their lights and you immediately, your unconscious sees that. and knows that there's a predator in that case. Yeah. And so let's see. In this case, whether the outer eye or of the sense of sight registers an outer perception, or the psyche with its unconscious knowledge detects a danger and transmits an inner image of perception to the inner intuitive eye, the interpretation remains the same. Both images are experienced by man as outside and have a tendency and an effect toward extroversion. The result is a change in man's behavior in relation to the outside world. And so I'm just going to step away for 30 seconds here and get this painting that Tim Holmes did as an example. I'll be right back. So this painting is called Freighter Imperiled by Mountains. And so it's obviously first and foremost an outer image of the mountains, but then you'll see how it changes. It's quite a unique picture.
What's the title's first word? First two words?
Freighter Imperiled by Mountains. Okay.
What is freighter? Sorry.
Freighter, like a ship.
I see.
A cargo ship, right? Okay, I have to turn off my cloaking for a moment to show you this, otherwise you won't see it. Okay, so here's the mountains, right? And then you go across. I can't see it myself. Okay, so here's the mountains. But then, stand up so I can see the image. So here's what looks like clouds at first, but it's actually a wave. Mm-hmm. And there's the freighter.
Oh.
Okay, and it's a huge wave. Mm-hmm. So I gotta get this thing out of my way. Okay. So it's hard to show the whole thing because it's very wide, but there's the freighter, and it's obviously
what color is the freighter?
Right here, it's black and
I see. Yes.
Dark brown. Do you see it?
Yes.
It's a ship, mm-hmm. right? And it's on this wave, this enormous wave, mm-hmm. and this enormous wave is inundating the mountains.
Yes.
And here's a little city down below, mm-hmm. right? And so this part of it, Tim was seeing in the outside world. But
yes.
From an environmental perspective, this is what he was seeing on the inside world mm-hmm. regarding what can happen if we allow global warming. And so here's this freighter that's imperiled mm-hmm. by these mountains. It's quite an interesting painting, but it exactly shows us what Neumann was talking about in that section.
Well, those who are closer to unconscious will speak the truth. Like in Farsi, they say that if you want to hear the truth, ask a child.
Right.
And then
yeah.
Kings will keep gestures, and they would actually, with their sarcasm and fun, poking hole, and with the right. security that was guaranteed to them, they were authorized to speak. They would actually bring out like what they could see with the fresh eyes of reality, without the court pressures and political whatever negotiations that were going on.
Right. I've often said that someone could write a bestseller by simply, as their child is developing, every time their child says something that's funny mm-hmm. to them or strange, something strange, usually it's funny because they're seeing something that you aren't seeing, right? And so it's very often funny. And if you write all those down from, let's say, the age of a year and a half to age 5, that child is actually the best comedian on earth.
Yes.
And
They say it as they see it without any filtering.
right, no filters.
Very funny, yes.
Right. And so far I haven't run into a book like this, but even I knowing this, I knew this when my children were young. But you're so busy being a parent, you don't think to actually sit down there and write it down and what the circumstances were and so on. Because if you did that, you wouldn't, every child actually, it happens in every child's life. So everybody has the raw material to write this best-selling comedic book, but nobody does it. And
well, looking at something together, which has the element of unconscious, like together looking at a painting has that effect, or a movie. I know a friend who said that when he makes a new friend, after a time, he invites that person for a drink together. Now, this really makes sense because on the rational level, maybe they're friends. But what about if both of them are intoxicated and now the filters are down and the ego consciousness is not filtering? Do the unconscious also shake hands and are loving each other and close to each other? And the reality actually comes out like a sun shining, because here the unconscious dims the consciousness, and then when they're a little bit drunk, they will tell the truth to each other, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And this
The
actually
work of art is the same, and dreams are the same. That's why you can share dreams with the close ones.
Yeah, that's actually why something that happened to Tim and me, where he sent me my portrait, and at first I reacted negatively to my portrait because I had hoped that he would have me with a smile, so I'm often laughing and have a smile on my face. but he actually did something else that I wanted him to do, which was to give me a Mona Lisa smile, so you couldn't tell whether I'm smiling or frowning, which he did. And but my first reaction to this portrait was not a positive one, and I didn't have time to really study it because we were going out that evening, and it came in, and I had to leave. And so later on, I saw the portrait in the dark. And when I saw the portrait in the dark, not only did I see the likeness of the portrait, but I also saw the portrait in 3 dimensions. And this was without my spectacles. So I was, on my way to the bathroom in the middle of the night. The house was dark and only had any lights from night lights on, perhaps. And so it was, in a state of gloom, let's say, the gloomy light atmosphere. And I looked at the portrait, and I did it without my spectacles on. And I said, oh my God, I see the resemblance there. Not only do I see the resemblance, but I see it in 3 dimensions. And so I said that to Tim, and he said, that's totally unfair.
You have to look at the dark.
That I have to look at it in the dark, and I get these things coming, and I say, wait a minute, Tim, you don't know anything about me. This is nothing. This is
actually value of it. Yes.
Yeah,
that's the value of it.
And so
Dr. Marie-Louise von Franz said that initially she started putting her dogs would come to the room, in the analysis room.
Yeah.
And 1 and later 2. And she found their presence very helpful, because she said that when there was a change in the consciousness or the unconscious of the analysant, the dogs would also change, and she could actually see it much better. So she's found like a purpose of them being there, like a value.
Yeah.
Again, the unconscious is helping, like us navigate what's going on.
Right. Okay, so let me just look here. From Texas thought that it was an ominous landscape in the painting. Very surreal. It's certainly surreal, but the point of putting this enormous wave coming across the Rocky Mountains is, you go, is that what global warming is going to bring us to? And, maybe it's not going to happen at the Continental Divide where Tim lives at 3,500 feet, but it certainly can happen in Vancouver. And you could imagine a Planet of the Apes scenario where 300 years from now, Vancouver has been abandoned because the sea level has come up so much that there are regular waves and tides that come right through the downtown area in Vancouver. And so you could actually have that scene, and
or we can collaborate very closely with the engineers and designers from Netherlands, and they're actually way ahead of the rest of the world in building structures under the water and between land and the water, and they're doing very well. They're actually selling that technology to other countries.
Yeah. Well, not always, because they are the guys that are doing it. But I have experience with this where finally they were building the palms in Dubai by terraforming, where they were doing landfill, and then they were building these high-end homes on these things that are shaped like palm trees. They're actually supposed to be 3 of them, but the third one they couldn't build because it kept getting washed away by the current. And then that same thing happened with the world. They were going to create a map of the world by terraforming, and they had actually created a couple of the islands that would be in this map of the world, and people had spent millions of dollars to buy that particular island or that particular place where it was represented as Spain or Italy or whatever it was. And they only got about 2 of them built. And they actually built high value homes on them and so on. And they were washing away because they hadn't anticipated that Mother Nature is a little bit more powerful than their ability to terraform.
About 10 years ago, I did a research. Like right now, humanity is not living in an efficient way. They're spread far away all across the world. But when the population of Earth was around 7 billion, it was said that the entire population of the world, human beings, can live in a land area equal to Texas if they are densely populated like New York City.
Yeah.
So probably there will be a huge change in how people would live.
Yeah. So meanwhile, there's a couple of items here that I want to comment on, and we'll wrap it up for today. But first, I'll take from Texas's points, which he said that was an ominous landscape in the painting, very surreal. The boat is at the mercy of the wind and waves, very much so. Painting reminds me that we are islands of mortality surrounded by death. And yeah, that's, you could actually call that painting that. And then there was a question that now has been retracted, but I'm going to answer it anyway. And the question was, what's the difference between persona, anima, and animus? So let me, I'm going to, because these are basic terms in Jungian psychology, I'm going to very quickly answer this question. And the answer is that persona is like the mask you wear in public. And so when you see me on a Sunday morning and I'm wearing a purple shirt, that's my United States of America persona, right? but I don't always wear purple shirts. I keep wanting to buy more, but nonetheless, I don't have a complete wardrobe of purple shirts. But my persona today is Skip with the purple shirt, which Tim also put in the portrait, as you'll remember, Idris, because you
Yes,
were
I do.
involved in that session. And but Anima and Animus are actually that which animates. So for a man, it's a female figure typically, and so the anima is that which causes us to move into life, that which animates our life, and that's falling in love at first sight. And for women too, except it's animus is what is typically found in women. So when there's love at first sight, that's the man's anima saying, wow, that's the woman for me. And for the woman, it's the animus that's saying, wow, that's the man for me. And so I can, I've actually shown this many times before, but I will show this image, which is my mother, and it roughly corresponds to my anima, which probably is men's mothers in most cases. So this is my mother when she was 18, and about 1 year before I was born, as a matter of fact. And so she sort of set for me, and probably your mother sets for you, what is the most beautiful female in the world if you're a man. And so as it happens, very typically my wives, I've had two wives, and Debbie is my second one, but both of my wives have dark hair like this and dark eyes, and actually match this template that was created by my mother. So that's what I would say that the anima is in short order. And obviously when you're young, your mother is animating your life, telling you you have to do this, you have to do that, and so on. And that's pushing you along. And, your father, if you're a man, you don't have to be pushed along to be like your father. If you're a man, you want to be in the family business typically. And so you push in that direction. But you have to be attracted to the woman. And for a woman, the opposite is true, and it's her animus, where she's drawn to the man that seems most like her father. And this is where my first marriage got into trouble, because my wife's animus in the early stage said, okay, Skip is young and he has the potential to be like my father. But later on, when I was different from that, she was trying to improve me, correct me, to be like her father. And that simply wasn't going to happen because, among other things, one of the things that her father archetypally did was to cut the grass with a ride-on lawnmower. And he loved
I think here was her opportunity to assimilate her animus. If she would bring the animus within herself, then she would stop that expectation from you. That was a moment.
Yeah, that's right. And unfortunately, at the time, I didn't know all this. And so she kept trying to get me to do things that her father would do, like liking to cut the grass. But for me, and you can hear it in my voice right now because I'm, you know, having trouble speaking, but it's because I have allergies to everything that's green and grows. And so if I cut the grass, I start sneezing, and it's not a pleasurable activity for me. And so most of the years of my adult life, I've hired grass cutting to young kids who will do it.
Do you remember when it was coinciding with your sessions every Wednesday?
Yeah, that's right.
They just wanted to come at that time. They didn't want to come at any other hour.
we actually moved the day of the session twice, trying to get away from them. They kept changing right after us. So anyway, in the end, I couldn't match the template which my ex-wife expected of me to have.
And that's also a persona expectation. Persona is an unconscious, collective unconscious segment. People expect certain things.
So anyway, that's what those two things mean, Mohammed, just for your information. And so I think I'll terminate this at this point. I've been talking for 2 hours and 15 minutes.
I'll watch the replay from what I missed. But thank you very much for your contribution. I actually listened to your videos from 2 years ago and 3 years ago, and I learned so much. So
that's good to hear.
I take notes, and I've bought some reference books that you actually have spoken about. They all helped me very much. My most recent acquisition is Splendor Solace. The color. I'm very happy I received it.
Yeah, it's an interesting book, and it's something that was created in the 1580s. I think
1581 for sure.
Yeah, right. And so anyway, thank you everyone.
Thank you very much
for being here, and we'll do it again next week.
Have a nice day, everyone. Have a nice day, Skip.
Thank you for joining me, because I need
it was my pleasure.
I need more people to push me along on this session.
It was sheer pleasure. Thank you very much.
Yeah, take care.
Take
Thanks, Idris. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.